I'm honored to be here as part of this important symposium today, and particularly honored to follow Richard to the podium, but also Ambassadors Dermer and Harper, as well, of course, as Erwin Kotler, who is a hero to many of us. And for those who didn't know why before, certainly had a chance to hear now, I think, why. He is known by some as the Alan Dershowitz of Canada, and then I understand there are those who refer to Dersh as the Erwin Kotler of the United States. So we gather on the 10th anniversary of the ICJ decision with respect to the security fence. It's another almost 10th anniversary, and I want to twin these two 10th anniversaries. July 9th, 2004 was the decision of the ICJ, but June 30th, just not quite 10 days before that, was the decision or the judgment issued by the Israeli Supreme Court, then President Aaron Barak of the Israeli Supreme Court, on a path-breaking case dealing with the security fence. And I will sort of start with the end of the story, because I'll conclude my remarks with a quote from Justice Barak's judgment that day. But I think it is fair to say that there is not another country in the world, and I'm wary of the risk of hyperbole here, I think there's not another country in the world where a judicial body would take on this issue, would have the legitimacy to take on this issue, would issue a judgment with respect to issues that plainly involve national security. And I want to say two things, the less important of which is that the judgment was enforced and the exact course of the security fence was changed as a result. That's the less important of which. The more important of which is, and no one was surprised that that was the response to the court. The fact that no one was surprised is itself astonishing. I will use an example of probably the only other country where such a thing could happen. Forgive me an autobiographical moment. When I was in law school, it was not long after the Watergate matter, and that was the issue that had us all consumed as young law students. And I remember a group of us sitting around with the late Charles Black. Some of you may remember, my great mentor at the Yale Law School, a great constitutional scholar. And we kept asking him, but what if President Nixon hadn't turned over the tapes? The Supreme Court ordered him to turn over the tapes. I mean, he's the commander-in-chief of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. What if he hadn't turned over the tapes? I will truncate Charlie Black's long description, but at the end of it, in this great Texas drawl, he said, I do believe you're asking me which side will the colonels line up on. He said, my answer is twofold. I don't know, but I do not believe that's how it will ever happen in the United States of America. And of course, it's not what would happen in the United States of America. And the fact that the United States Supreme Court ordered the President of the United States to turn over the tapes, that was a significant moment. The fact that the President then turned over the tapes was almost taken for granted. The fact that it was taken for granted is astonishing. The fact that the Israeli Supreme Court would issue a judgment with respect to the direction, the shape, the nature of a security fence clearly designed, as Ambassador Dermer told us in very compelling terms, to save lives. It has saved lives. Thank God it continues to save lives. The fact that a court would issue such a judgment is striking. That it would be enforced without question is astonishing. And we ought not to lose that moment of astonishment. Now, Richard asked me to straddle my two worlds, if you will, as legal scholar, as university president, and as someone who lives in the world of university presidents, which means budgets and hirings and admissions. And dear God, Richard, I'm spending an entire 3-hour group with these wonderful people. I don't have to ask anybody for money. It's practically like not being a university president. Talk about being off duty. So pulling together the two parts of my life, what I want to spend a few moments reflecting on is what do these two judicial moments, the ICJ opinion and one piece of it that I'll turn to in a moment, and Justice Barak's judgment in the case involving the security fence, what do they tell us about how these issues might well be and better be discussed on campuses? I don't pretend that campuses are the only place in which these issues are discussed, but I think it's important for two reasons. One is because we are in some place the crucible for whatever is possible of an open discussion. If there is any place in the society where there should be free exchange of ideas and where the best ideas should triumph, it should be on university campuses. We should be the exemplar of where the discussion happens at its best. The other is that we are the funnel point of the future. We are, I say on a daily basis, and when I walk across the Brandeis campus with students from 130 different countries today, I'm reminded on a daily basis, we are the gatekeepers to the American dream. And we have that obligation proudly. As a result, what takes place on campuses has a exaggerated effect of what it might otherwise, because we are not merely dealing with young people who happen to be on college campuses at any moment. We are dealing with the people who will be the leaders, the framers, the teachers, the opinion makers and framers of the future. So what can we learn from these two decisions? Now, when I say the ICJ decision, I really do mean to focus not on the majority opinions that are frequently discussed and that Richard describes in the title for our symposium, Assessing 10 Years Since the Unjust Advisory Opinion by the International Court of Justice on the Construction of Israel's Terrorism Prevention Security Fence, but rather by the extraordinarily insightful, courageous, in my view, compelling dissenting opinion by Judge Thomas Bergenthal. Full disclosure here, Tom Bergenthal happens to be a good friend. I don't think this biases my views at all, in part because my friendship with Tom Bergenthal is all subsequent to the opinion, and I met him in some ways because of my admiration for him from his writing. Also, I like to think that I played some role in bringing him back to the George Washington University Law School, where he had come from when he became the American judge on the ICJ. I was successful in doing that. Unfortunately, my calling, it took me to Waltham to become president of Brandeis, so Tom Bergenthal and I have actually never been colleagues. He came to Brandeis shortly after I left. He came to George Washington shortly after I came to Brandeis. Nonetheless, he has been a dear friend and is involved in our ethics center on the Brandeis campus. But Tom Bergenthal, who some of you may know from his extraordinary work, A Lucky Child, his Holocaust memoir, and when you think you have read the last Holocaust memoir you can bear to read, I urge you to pick up A Lucky Child and to read Tom Bergenthal's experience. It's not an ironic title, that's all I can tell you. A young boy who said that Auschwitz was my kindergarten. Begins by saying what sounds like a very small point, which is that the International Court of Justice should not be issuing this advisory decision because it does in fact not have all the facts. In fact, to make his point, he sort of gives with one hand and then takes back with the other. I'm open to the possibility, he says, that if we have all the facts, it could well be that what the majority says is correct. It could well be that the security fence is a violation of international law. It could well be. Right? This is how a judge like Bergenthal is able to persuade those who don't already start to agree with him. Allow me a 30-second digression. We had a great celebration in The Hague when Judge Bergenthal stepped down from the ICJ. In fact, we had our board of advisors of the law school meet during that time, and a number of his colleagues on the ICJ were there. I had a chance to chat with them afterwards. I think of Tom as this hero of international law. I think of Tom as this visionary jurisprudential figure. Turns out he's also one of those guys who is a genius at going chambers to chambers and putting the votes together. Because a number of them said, with Bergenthal not here, who's going to play that role? Who's going to be the deal maker in the best sense of that term? In the best sense of that term, of putting coalitions together. So Bergenthal couldn't get other votes for this opinion, but he knew how to reach out to the broader court of public opinion and say, we don't have the facts to make this decision. Why don't we have the facts to make this decision? This is an advisory opinion. Because it's an advisory opinion, Israel has no obligation to provide any particular facts or answer any particular questions. This is not a contentious matter, what we would call a litigated matter in our context. Therefore, no inference should be drawn against Israel from what statements have not been made. The entire advisory opinion was built, in fact, around drawing inferences against Israel, inferring from a lack of facts. There is one very powerful assertion that Bergenthal makes, and as you'll see, it's a legal matter. It doesn't require a factual record to make it. And that is that Article 51, which is the right of every nation to defend itself, that Richard really began our discussion with, applies not only with respect to state actors, but applies as well to the right of self-defense to non-state actors. So obviously what he is doing in that very powerful assertion is to say that the state of Israel has a natural right, if you will, a human right on behalf of its citizens to defend itself, and not just against state actors, but against non-state actors. He is situating terrorism in the context of war, and the right to defend oneself is a legal right, a natural right, a human right. So, set the Bergenthal dissent aside just for a second and now turn to the Barak judgment. What Judge Barak precisely did was to fill in the context that Judge Bergenthal said was absent from the advisory opinion of the ICJ. And here I could rehearse the entire context that Judge Barak rehearses, but you have the advantage of having heard much of that by the prior speakers. That context that does not begin in 2004. It does not begin in 1967. In truth, it does not begin in 1947, but to a certain extent we can begin part of the discussion there. That context creates a justification. And for the lawyers in the room, I carefully use the word justification, not an excuse. An excuse says that something that would not otherwise be permitted is understood for various extenuating circumstances. A justification is something that is actually legally, morally justified on its own terms. A justification for the existence of a security fence that is there for what reason? As an act, as an extension, as an articulation of the right of self-defense. Now, because this is the Israeli Supreme Court, Judge Barak says there is a test of proportionality where the court must balance liberty and security. And he does an exquisite analysis of where proportionality argues for where the fence is properly drawn and where he and his colleagues on the court argue the fence is improperly drawn. As I said earlier, astonishing that a court takes that on by balancing liberty and security. And what flows from that judgment is an order to redraw parts of the boundary that would be represented by the fence. And it is followed. Now, what do we learn when we pull these two together? Context, background for a discussion, is what is critically necessary, not just to make it a fuller discussion, which is obviously true, but is only up on the surface. It is precisely the lack of context, it is precisely the lack of history, it is the ahistoricizing of the conflict that creates the delegitimization that Erwin Kotler is talking about. It is precisely this lack of history that Ambassador Dermer talks about. I love that expression, history goes back to breakfast. But it's not just a lack of depth to the argument. It is an extremely insidious and dangerous piece of our subject. Because when the history is pulled out, if you will, when the clock is started running too late, when the camera starts running too late, then it is very easy, in the context of the world in which I live, of university students, for the following argument to be made. So I'm going to ask you for the next 30 seconds, for those, particularly the younger people in the room who know the great classic movie Men in Black, imagine that Right? About 10 of you just laughed, and if the others would look at one of the people who just laughed, they'll explain to you what I'm talking about. There's a wonderful device in Men in Black called the flashy thing. Right? They flash you with it, and you forget everything that you just saw. Right? Those of you know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about. The rest of you think I just slightly lost my mind. But you spend your time with 18 to 22-year-olds, this is how you think. So I'm going to hit you all with a flashy thing for a second. I want you to forget everything you know about the Middle East conflict. I want you to forget everything you know about the history that goes back not to 1947, but thousands of years. And now I'm going to tell you a story that says, I am making a claim on behalf of my people in that part of the world, and all we're saying is there should be one country where everyone's treated the same. Everyone gets to vote, no distinctions on the basis of religion or background, and we'll have one country that goes from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, everybody, one person, one vote. Now, to the American ear, that sounds very appealing, doesn't it? As a matter of fact, to the American ear, you wouldn't necessarily want to be the one who'd have to say, no, there's actually a reason that there has to be a Jewish state. Why does it have to be a Jewish state? You know, I'm an American. We have separation of church and state. You see how insidious the argument is when you pull all the history out. All right, now I'm going to unflashy thing you. Right? Bring back thousands of years of history. Right? Bring back the nature of the conflict. Bring back what brought us up to the 2004, and bring back what brings us up to 2014. Dear God, bring back what brings us to bombs falling, rockets falling today. And once we have that context, then it's revealed as delegitimization. Right? That is the essence to me of the challenge posed by the BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. It is a movement that is inherently based on dehistoricizing a context, taking the history out, and then making an argument that actually sounds very appealing. So what is the answer to that? Well, particularly on college campuses, now not ironically on college campuses, particularly on college campuses, it is precisely about putting the context in. It is precisely understanding what Bergenthal's call was when he said, you have no right to make this decision without the facts before you, because you will get it wrong, and you will get it wrong in a dangerous way. And it's precisely the genius of Barak who says, when you see the context, then you see the need for offense and the need to have a balanced discussion about what's the nature of that offense, which the Supreme Court of one of the most extraordinary democracies in the world will articulate, and which the military of one of the most extraordinary nations in the world will follow. So how does that discussion then go forward? Now, let me give 4 examples, and then I'll conclude, as I said, with a quote from Aaron Barak's judgment. But let me give 4 examples from close to home, if I may, from the Brandeis campus. And I will candidly admit that given the nature of our school, also founded in 1948, uniquely grounded in the American Jewish community, we are in some ways not a cross-section of what campuses are. But I will turn that around and I will say it is precisely because of the nature of our school, because of the inextricable connection between Brandeis University and the State of Israel. It is precisely because we have that opportunity that I believe we have a moral obligation to function in that way. So let me give you examples of how does one rehistoricize the conflict. And I will tell you what the stakes are here. Erwin Cutler told us we have to be very careful of not just talking to each other. You know, we live in a world, given the chat rooms we hang out in, given the websites we tend to go to, given the papers and the websites we tend to read, and even given the TV news we tend to follow, that we tend to be not so much involved in dialogues as a sort of in grand contrapuntal monologues in our society. So we have to find ways not just of talking to others who already agree with us, but of reaching across and at least joining issue with those who disagree. Aspirationally confounding them, and the highest level of aspiration, persuading them. Whether we persuade them or not is not necessarily the way to measure the success. Whether you make the case or not certainly is. So I'll give you 4 examples from the Brandeis campus. One, the Israel Studies Center on our campus, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, is the preeminent Israel Studies Center outside of the State of Israel. And my colleagues at the Schusterman Center would argue, including the State of Israel. I don't intend to be quite that parochial today, although I can be. The whole purpose of the Schusterman Center is to create and to advance the field of Israel studies, not as an area of advocacy, as an area of scholarly discipline, confident in the notion that the field will make its case. That the greater the understanding, the greater the recontextualization of the discussion, the stronger the case for Israel will be. The volume needn't be loud, the light need only be bright. The Schusterman Center, I will simplify their work in two areas. There are many more, but let me give two areas. One is the prime place for studying and preparing and producing PhDs and also postdoctoral fellows in various fields of Israel studies, involving those you're already thinking of, political science and history, but those you're not probably thinking of, sociology, art history, philosophy, and other fields, all of which have their heart in understanding the whole nature of the broad-based interdisciplinary field of Israel studies. That's a piece for training experts. Equally important is something we do every summer, just concluded this summer, a summer institute for training non-expert academics in other fields who wish to teach Israel studies on their campuses. As of this summer, we've trained our latest cohorts. We have over 200 new academics capable of teaching Israel studies now, who over the past decade have trained literally thousands of students worldwide, not just in North America, but throughout the world. My personal project has brought us to helping to co-found an Israel Studies Center at Jindal Global University just outside of Delhi, the first Israel Studies Center in South Asia. Well, you knew it wasn't going to be in Pakistan, right? And the fact that India is connected with Israel in this very powerful way and that we can play some role in triangulating that is another example of making the case by historicizing the conflict. And you know what my Israeli friends like to say, between us and the Indians, we have over 1 billion people. So that's in the area of Israel studies. Now in a related but significantly different area, we have, by my lights, the preeminent Middle Eastern Studies Center, Strategic Studies Center, the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies. The Crown Center is precisely, again, not an advocacy institute. Let us be very clear. Many institutions in this country that claim to be Middle Eastern Studies centers, in fact, have an anti-Israel bias. And some, not all, but some, I would even go as far as to say, have an anti-Semitic aspect to their work. We are determined to have a Middle Eastern Studies Center that combats that not by being anti-Arab and not by being anti-Muslim, but by being deeply analytic, rigorous, interdisciplinary in its work. And as a result, to give one example, my colleagues from the Crown Center are on a regular basis consulted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To me, this is powerful because in a world that is so filled with polarization and ideological split, bless them, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have no time or patience for politics or ideology. They need to know what's going on. They need to make decisions based on what's really happening. The fact that they reach out to my colleagues tells me that we are doing something very significant and very important. And again, rehistoricizing the conflict and filling in the facts of the conflict will make the case. On campus, on the student side, and here again, I think of Erwin challenging us to not just talk to each other, to reach out more broadly. I told you we have students from 130 countries. They will go back, most of them, to those countries when they graduate. These are my force multipliers. These are my ambassadors, including, especially, the ones from Muslim countries. They will be in rooms that most of us will not be in. They will hear things that most of us will not hear. And they will have the opportunity to say, that's not my experience. That's not what I saw. That's not the world I lived in. Our discussion group, umbrella group, concerning Israel is something called BView, which stands for Brandeis Visions of Israel in an Evolving World. It's essentially a wall-to-wall coalition. I guarantee everyone in the room will find somebody in this group you do not like. I got your attention now, don't I? I will tell you what I said the day of the first opening BView conference. They gave me a whole set of bullet points, as they tend to, and I walked up with my bullet points ready to talk, and there on the wall were 3 banners: Brandeis University, APAC, J Street. I pointed at those 3 banners and I say, there's not another university in North America where that could happen. And God bless you for the important work you're going to do. Now, you notice I left somebody out. Coalition is broad. It doesn't mean it's universal. Doors are open. That doesn't mean you kick the walls out. What happens to BDS in that discussion? Oh, there's BDS people on campus. They're allowed to have their view too. I believe in that. They're allowed to have their say. But they're not part of a coalition, broad, with many views expressed on a daily basis I do not share. Thank God that's not the standard. What does the president share and not share? But all premised not just in the recognition of Israel's right to exist, but starting one step past that. May I just say that I bristle at the expression of defending Israel's right to exist? The fact is, that should go on the list of truths we hold to be self-evident. There is no other country that has to defend its right to exist. Or let me put it more academically. Perhaps we should have a broad discussion where every country has to defend its right to exist. That could be a very interesting discussion. But I'll look for volunteers before I'll volunteer my people to lead that discussion. Israel doesn't have to be the first, shouldn't be called upon to be the first. Finally, it's not all happy issues. There are times when one is required to take a stand. Some of you will recall last year when the American Studies Association, shamefully at its convention, voted to boycott Israel. And we were the first university to pull out of the American Studies Association. And I was among the first presidents to criticize the resolution. By the time the dust settled, about 200 presidents had, and I do believe we made an important watershed moment there. I don't pretend those issues are over, not by a long shot. It wasn't just liberty as to which vigilance, eternal vigilance is the price. If we're to protect Israel and the discussion on campuses, it will also require eternal vigilance. But I do believe what happened with the American Studies Association was very significant in putting a flag in the ground and saying why this would not be something we would be associated with. And so in all these ways, it seems to me it is about recontextualizing, rehistoricizing, bringing a kind of background into a discussion that the case will make itself. No one did that better than Aaron Barak, and let me conclude by reading and sharing with you his remarks at the end of his judgment. Our task is difficult, he wrote. Our task is difficult. We are members of Israeli society. Although we are sometimes in an ivory tower, that tower is in the heart of Jerusalem, which is not infrequently struck by ruthless terror. I have to tell you, I read this morning and it stuck in my throat. He wrote these words a little over 10 years and a week ago. That tower is in the heart of Jerusalem, which is not infrequently struck by ruthless terror. We are aware of the killing and destruction wrought by terror against the state and its citizens. As any other Israelis, we too recognize the need to defend the country and its citizens against the wounds inflicted by terror. We are aware that in the short term, this judgment will not make the state's struggle against those rising up against it easier. But we are judges. When we sit in judgment, we are subject to judgment. We act according to our best conscience and understanding. Regarding the state's struggle against the terror that rises up against it, we are convinced that at the end of the day, a struggle according to the law will strengthen her power and her spirit. There is no security without law. Satisfying the provisions of the law is an aspect of national security. I am proud to say that the two Supreme Courts that I feel I owe some allegiance to, the United States Supreme Court and the Israel Supreme Court, are the courts on this planet that still talk that way. Thank you.